Hey fam, good to see you back. Before we dive into today's mystery, Sherlock Holmes and the secrets of the Withering Garden, I want to know, what's something that made you smile today? And where in the world are you listening from? I'll be sharing a few of your shout-outs next time, so don't be shy. All right, get comfy, maybe grab a cup of tea, let's get into it. Because around here, things are never quite what they seem. Chapter 1. The Letter at the Breakfast Table. It was on a particularly dreary morning in late October that I found Sherlock Holmes standing at the window of our Baker Street lodgings, his lean figure silhouetted against the wan light of the overcast sky. A damp mist clung to the city, obscuring the gas lamps and rendering the throngs of passers-by into little more than ghostly shapes hurrying along the streets. Another fine example of London's enthusiasm for melancholy, Holmes observed dryly, without turning his head. I smiled as I buttered a piece of toast. Holmes's moods were often as mercurial as the weather, though I had grown used to them after years of companionship. Before I could comment, there came a sharp knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson bustled in, a sealed letter upon a silver tray. "Special delivery, Mr. Holmes," she announced, placing the tray carefully upon the table. Holmes took the envelope with a gloved hand, examining it closely before opening it. I noted the heavy quality of the paper, the dark green wax seal bearing a family crest, and the strong, confident hand that had addressed it. He broke the seal, scanned the contents quickly, and then tossed the letter across to me with a flick of his wrist. "Pray, Watson, indulge yourself," he said. "You will find it intriguing." I picked up the letter and read to 121B Baker Street. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Sir, I beg you to come to Withering Garden at your earliest convenience. A series of inexplicable occurrences have unsettled the household, culminating yesterday in the disappearance of Miss Violet Marchmont, my niece and ward. Scotland Yard has been notified, but has dismissed the matter as a simple elopement. I am convinced otherwise. Your reputation for discerning the hidden truth precedes you. Please assist us before further calamity strikes. Yours in urgency, sir." Alistair Marchmont Holmes had taken up his violin and was plucking idly at the strings. "You see, Watson, even in our present state of enforced inactivity, the world conspires to draw us back into its labyrinth of intrigue. Withering Garden?" I mused aloud. "I seem to recall hearing of the estate. Surrey, is it not?" "Indeed. A once grand estate now fallen into disrepair, if gossip is to be believed. An appropriate backdrop for mystery, wouldn't you say?" Holmes set down his violin and sprang into activity with a suddenness that startled me. He paced the room, gathering his coat, his hat, and his walking stick. "We must not delay," he said briskly. When a man of Sir Alister's standing abandons discretion to summon me by special courier, it is safe to assume the matter is of some gravity." I rose hastily, stuffing the remainder of my toast into my mouth as I reached for my own coat. Holmes was already halfway down the stairs. "Come, Watson," he called. "The game's scent is fresh, and I would not have it grow cold." Outside the mist seemed to thicken as we hailed a hansom cab. Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes bright with anticipation. "I wonder," he murmured more to himself than to me, "what secrets lie among the withering gardens of Surrey?" The cab rattled away from Baker Street, swallowed by the ever-hungry fog. We were on our way to a case that, as I was soon to discover, would test the very limits of my understanding, and illuminate once again the extraordinary faculties of Sherlock. Holmes? Chapter 2. The House at Withering Garden. The journey to Surrey was a slow and ponderous affair, the mist pressing close against the windows of the train, as though it were a living thing intent on blotting out the world. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes closed, but his mind, I knew, keenly alert. Upon arrival at the village of Withering Cross, we hired a small carriage to take us the remaining distance to Withering Garden. The villagers we passed seemed dour and tight-lipped, their gazes flickering toward us with barely concealed curiosity before hastily looking away. There was an atmosphere of unease about the place, a sort of invisible malaise that clung to the crooked lanes and low stone walls. At last the carriage rounded a bend, and Withering Garden came into view, a grand house that had clearly once enjoyed a stately elegance, but now wore the unmistakable air of decay. Ivy strangled the old stone facade, and several shutters hung askew, tapping gently against the windows in the moist autumn breeze. A fountain at the centre of the gravel drive was dry and choked with dead leaves, the statue at its heart a marble angel missing one wing. Sir Alister Marchmont awaited us at the entrance, a tall, stern-faced gentleman with iron-grey hair and a neatly trimmed moustache. His frock coat was immaculate, but there was a tightness about his mouth and a haunted look in his deep-set eyes that bespoke a man under considerable strain. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, his voice clipped and formal. "Thank you for coming. Please, step inside." The entrance hall was a cavernous space, its oak-panelled walls lined with ancestral portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to follow us with mute disapproval. The air within was chill and musty, as if the house itself resented intrusion. Sir Alister led us to a drawing-room where a fire had been lit, though it did little to dispel the pervasive dampness. He gestured for us to sit, then remained standing himself, one hand clenched behind his back. "You have read my letter," he began without preamble. "You know the bare facts. Violet is missing, vanished, and no one can or will explain how." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Begin, if you please, with the circumstances of her disappearance. Spare no detail, however trivial it may seem." Sir Alister hesitated a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Yesterday morning, Violet broke her fast with us as usual. She seemed in good spirits. After breakfast, she announced her intention to walk the grounds, as was her habit. That was the last anyone saw of her. And there were no witnesses, no one who saw her leave or noted anything unusual." Holmes interjected. "None," Sir Alister said heavily. "The gardener, Mr. Hargreaves, reports seeing her by the old rose garden around 11 o'clock. After that, nothing." Holmes's eyes glinted with interest. "The rose garden. Tell me about it." Sir Alister allowed himself a grim smile. "It was once the pride of the estate. Now it is a ruin, neglected, overgrown, with half the paths swallowed by weeds. Hardly a place for a young lady to wander alone." "And yet she did," Holmes murmured. "I sent men to search every inch of the grounds," Sir Alister continued. "We found no trace, no footprints, no torn fabric. It is as though she simply ceased to exist." Holmes tapped his fingers lightly against the arm of his chair. Has Miss Marchmont ever exhibited any, how shall I put it, romantic inclinations that might explain a voluntary departure? Sir Alister's expression hardened. Violet is a Marchmont. She would not disgrace herself or her family. Besides, she was betrothed to Lord Nathaniel Carroway. The banns were to be read next Sunday. Holmes's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Was she content with this arrangement? Sir Alister hesitated. She was dutiful, perhaps not effusive, but she understood her obligations. Holmes made no comment, but rose abruptly. I would examine her chambers, if you please. Sir Alister led us up a broad staircase, the wood creaking underfoot. The hallway above was lined with doors, each marked with brass nameplates. A remnant of a more prosperous age, no doubt, Violet's room was near the end of the corridor. It was a bright, airy chamber with a large bay window overlooking the tangled remains of the rose garden. A dressing table sat beneath a mirror, its surface neat but not untouched. Holmes prowled. The room, his gaze sharp and methodical. Was anything taken from her belongings? He asked, lifting a silver hairbrush to inspect it under the light. Nothing that we can determine, Sir Alister replied. Her clothes, her jewellery, all remain. Holmes nodded absently, crouching to examine the carpet near the window. He ran his hand lightly along the fabric, then straightened, his eyes gleaming. Watson, observe, he said softly, pointing. There, faint but unmistakable, was a smear of greenish mud along the hem of the heavy drapes. Curious, Holmes mused, very curious indeed. He turned to Sir Alister. Tell me, who else resides in the house? My sister, Lady Eugenia Marchmont, Violet's aunt, Mr. Hargreaves the gardener, whom I mentioned, Mrs. Dudgeon the housekeeper, and 2 maids, Elsie and Bridget. Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. A tidy circle, and no guests recently. None. Holmes smiled faintly. Then I believe our next course of action is clear. I must speak with each member of your household, beginning with Lady Eugenia. He turned to me, his grey eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. The scent grows stronger, Watson, he murmured, stronger and stranger. And with that he swept from the room, leaving me to hurry after him into the gathering gloom of Withering Garden. Chapter 3. The Circle of Suspects. Lady Eugenia Marchmont received us in her private sitting-room, a dimly lit chamber, heavy with the scent of dried lavender and old books. She was a woman of striking appearance, tall and gaunt, her silver hair drawn tightly into a chignon. Her thin hands fluttered like pale moths as she poured tea from a delicate porcelain service, her sharp grey eyes never leaving Holmes's face. You will forgive me if I dispense with pleasantries, Lady Eugenia, Holmes said, lowering himself into a stiff-backed chair. Time is of the essence. I understand you were among the last to see Miss Marchmont yesterday morning. Lady Eugenia's mouth tightened. I scarcely saw her at all. Violet was given to her walks. I warned her often enough against traipsing about that cursed garden. Cursed? Holmes echoed with interest. She waved a dismissive hand. An old family superstition. Nonsense, of course, but the place has an unfortunate history. Accidents, disappearances. Disappearance, you say? Prior to Miss Marchmont vanishing? Years ago, she said, her voice softening. A maid, poor girl. vanished one autumn night. It was attributed to elopement, as these things always are. Holmes's expression was unreadable. Tell me, Lady Eugenia, do you believe Violet left of her own volition? Lick. Eugenia set her teacup down with a decisive clink. I do not. She was a spirited girl, yes, but loyal to her family and mindful of her duties. If she has gone, it was not of her own choosing. Holmes inclined his head. Thank you. You have been most helpful. As we rose to leave, Lady Eugenia caught Holmes's sleeve with surprising strength. Find her, Mr. Holmes, she whispered. Whatever has taken her, find her. Outside the room, Holmes paused briefly in the corridor, his brow furrowed. Superstitions in a house of reason, Watson. Always a troubling sign. We made our way next to the service wing, where Mrs. Dudgeon, the housekeeper, awaited us. She was a stout woman with a lined, careworn face and an air of habitual deference. Nevertheless, there was a guardedness in her manner as she answered. Holmes' questions. Miss Marchmont was always kind to the staff, sir, she said. No airs or graces about her. She went out walking after breakfast, same as she often did. We thought nothing of it. Had she seemed distressed of late? Anxious? Distracted? Holmes asked. Mrs. Dudgeon shook her head. Not that I saw, sir, though— She hesitated. Speak freely, madam, Holmes encouraged. Well, there was a letter, Mrs. Dudgeon admitted reluctantly. Came 2 days ago. I brought it to Miss Marchmont myself. She went pale when she read it and tucked it away quick-like. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And you do not know the sender? No, sir. There was no return address. A private post, then. Curious. Holmes tapped his walking stick thoughtfully against the flagstones. Thank you, Mrs. Dudgeon. You have been of great assistance. We interviewed the 2 maids, Elsie and Bridget, in quick succession. Elsie, a nervous slip of a girl, could add nothing of value, while Bridget, sturdier and more composed, reported having seen Violet speaking with Mr. Hargreaves in the Rose garden shortly before her disappearance. He seemed upset, sir, Bridget added, red in the face, waving his hands. Holmes seized upon the detail at once. What time was this? Near 11 o'clock, sir. Holmes made a note in his pocket-book, his face inscrutable. Our final interview was with Mr. Hargreaves, the gardener. He was a rough-hewn man in his late 40s, with soil-stained hands and wary eyes. He met us outside the potting shed, leaning heavily on a spade. I told Sir Alister all I know, he said defensively before Holmes had spoken a word. All the same, Holmes said mildly, I would like to hear it from you. Hargreaves scrubbed a hand across his stubbled chin. I saw Miss Violet by the rose garden. She asked me about the restoration work on the old summer house. Said she wanted to see it when it was finished. And how did you respond? I told her. It wasn't safe yet. The supports are rotted through. She seemed disappointed, but said she'd wait. And you did not see her again? No, sir. Not after that. Holmes studied the man keenly. You were fond of Miss Marchmont, were you not? Hargreaves shifted uncomfortably. Everyone liked her, sir. She was kind. Treated us like folk, not servants. Holmes nodded, satisfied. One last question. Was anyone else in the vicinity of the garden yesterday morning? Hargreaves hesitated. Lord Carroway, sir. Came riding up about 10:30. Spoke to Miss Violet for a bit before heading back toward the stables. Holmes's eyebrows lifted fractionally. "Indeed. You are quite certain?" "Clear as day, sir." As we returned to the house, Holmes's stride lengthened, his mind evidently racing. "Note it well, Watson," he said. "The betrothed lover, the secret letter, the anxious aunt, the superstitious murmurs, all pieces of a puzzle that is yet far from complete." He paused at the foot of the stairs, his gaze lifting to the shadowed upper halls. "But the answer, a suspect, lies somewhere within the walls, or beneath the withered boughs of this mournful house." Chapter 4. Shadows over the Garden. After a brief consultation with Sir Alister, who grudgingly granted permission, Holmes and I set out to explore the gardens ourselves. A sullen drizzle had begun to fall, rendering the cracked flagstones slick beneath our boots and painting the dead leaves a glistening black. Holmes moved ahead of me with restless energy, his keen eyes missing nothing as we followed the winding paths towards the ruined rose garden. It was a grim sight. What had once been orderly rows of blossoms now lay in tangled profusion, briars clutching at the broken statues that lined the borders. The air was heavy with the sickly sweet scent of decay. In the centre stood the summer house, little more than a skeletal frame of rotting wood, its roof partially collapsed and one wall leaning precariously inward. Holmes approached it cautiously, testing each step before committing his full weight. He stopped beside a patch of disturbed earth near the threshold, brushing aside leaves to reveal a faint impression in the mud. "A footprint," he murmured. "Small, likely a woman's." I bent beside him. "Violet. Possibly," he said, frowning. "But observe, the depth suggests a sudden, forceful movement, as if she stumbled or was pulled." He rose and circled the structure, peering through the slats of the broken walls. "There, Watson, on the far side." I followed his pointing finger to a second patch of disturbed ground, this one deeper and more chaotic, as though a struggle had taken place. Holmes crouched again, examining the scene with minute care. At length he plucked something from the mud and held it up for my inspection. A small gold button, its surface tarnished but still gleaming faintly. "A woman's garment?" I ventured. "Perhaps, or an ornament," Holmes replied, slipping it carefully into a paper envelope. "In either case, it was torn away in haste." He straightened and surveyed the garden with a critical eye. "This was not the scene of a simple disappearance, Watson. Miss Marchmont encountered some form of violence here." We pressed deeper into the grounds, following the faint impressions Holmes had discerned. They led us toward the dense thicket of yew trees that bordered the rear of the property. The trees formed a near impenetrable wall of darkness, their twisted branches knitting together overhead. Holmes paused before the threshold of the thicket. "A curious feature," he said. "Tell me, Watson, what does this remind you of?" I considered the gloomy avenue. "A tunnel," I said at last, "or a hidden path." "Precisely." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And where hidden paths exist, so too may hidden purposes," pushed through the branches, and I followed close behind. The yew corridor was narrower than I had expected, barely wide enough for a man to pass. Yet, as we proceeded, the path became more distinct, the ground beneath our feet trodden bare of undergrowth. At intervals we found curious markers, stones set deliberately among the roots, and once a strip of blue ribbon snagged upon a low branch. At last, the path widened abruptly, and we found ourselves in a clearing dominated by a crumbling stone arch. Holmes circled it thoughtfully, his footsteps echoing against the moss-slick stones. An old folly, perhaps, he mused, or the remains of some earlier structure. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the oppressive air that seemed to hang about the place. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated. "Note the proximity to the garden, Watson. A secret path leading directly to an isolated ruin. It would be the perfect place for a clandestine meeting or an abduction." He knelt to examine the ground once more. "More footprints, some small, some larger. Recently, too, the rain has not yet washed them away." I peered closer. "You believe Miss Marchmont was brought here?" "Or fled here," Holmes said grimly. "Consider, if she did flee, what drove her to such desperate measures?" He stood, brushing the damp from his trousers. "Come, we must return to the house. There is a story buried here, Watson, a story written in mud and broken boughs, and I mean to read it." As we retraced our steps through the yew tunnel, the house loomed once more into view, its windows glimmering like watchful eyes through the mist. Holmes's face was set, his mind clearly racing ahead to possibilities I could only guess at. Back in the warmth of the drawing-room, Sir Alister awaited us with Lord Nathaniel Carroway at his side. The young lord was a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome, were it not for the habitual sneer that curled his lips. "You wished to see me, Mr. Holmes?" Carroway asked, his tone barely civil. Holmes studied him a moment before replying. "I understand. You were seen speaking with Miss Marchmont yesterday morning." Carroway stiffened. "I spoke to her briefly, yes. I came to remind her of our engagement." "And did you find her amenable?" Holmes asked, his voice deceptively mild. Carroway's sneer deepened. She was hesitant. Foolishly romantic notions had taken hold of her. She feared she would not be happy. "And what did you say to her?" "I told her happiness was a luxury we could ill afford. She had a duty to her family, and to me." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And after your conversation?" "I rode back to the stables," Carroway said shortly. "I had no further dealings with her." Holmes inclined his head. "I thank you for your candour, my lord." As Carroway strode from the room, Holmes turned to me, his voice low. "A heavy-handed suitor, Watson, and perhaps a desperate one." He pocketed the gold button he had found earlier, his expression grim. "We are closing in, my dear fellow," he said, "but whether upon a lost maiden or her ghost I cannot yet say." Chapter 9. The Ghosts That Linger. That evening, as the house stirred with renewed life after Violet's miraculous return, Holmes withdrew into the library, his features set in deep concentration. I, too restless to remain idle, busied myself tending to Violet, ensuring she rested comfortably under the vigilant care of Lady Eugenia and Mrs. Dudgeon. Sir Alister hovered nearby, a haunted figure whose every glance toward his niece was a silent prayer of gratitude. It was past 9 o'clock when Holmes summoned me with a curt knock at my door. I found him standing in the hall, his coat buttoned, his hat in hand. "Come, Watson," he said in a low voice. "The night is not yet spent, and there is an old wrong that demands our attention." Without further explanation, He led me outside into the heavy mist that clung to the gardens. The moon hung low behind veils of cloud, casting a wan light upon the crumbling statuary and the skeletal rose bushes. We made our way past the summer house, its broken frame black against the fog, and back toward the yew tunnel. The hidden path we had uncovered earlier now seemed almost a living thing, coiling through the night like a serpent. Holmes moved swiftly, lantern in hand, until we once more stood before the moss-covered arch in the clearing beyond the garden. Here he paused. "You recall, Watson," he said, "that Sir Alistair spoke of a vanished maid many years ago." "Yes," I said, drawing my coat tighter against the chill. Holmes raised the lantern, casting long shadows across the stone archway. "There is something about this place. Something more than a convenient passage for abduction or escape. There is a history buried here." He moved toward the base of the arch, probing the earth with the tip of his walking stick. The ground was soft from the day's rain, and it yielded easily. After a moment's work, Holmes struck something solid. "Kneel here," he directed, handing me the lantern. Together, we cleared away the sodden earth, revealing a flat stone slab, roughly the size of a coffin lid. Holmes found a rusted iron ring set into one side and pulled hard. With a groan of protesting hinges, the slab swung open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft descending into the earth. A ladder of rotted wood led downward into the gloom. Holmes smiled grimly. "Shall we, Watson?" Though every instinct in me recoiled, I could not let him descend alone. With a nod, I secured the lantern and followed him down into the darkness. The air below was damp and close, heavy with the scent of earth and mildew. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a small crypt, a hidden chamber hewn from the stone itself. It was clear that no one had trod here in many years. In the centre of the crypt, half collapsed and overgrown with roots, lay an ancient stone sarcophagus. Holmes approached it reverently, brushing away the debris that clung to its surface. The inscription was faint but legible under the lantern's beam. Beatrice Marchmont, 1847-1868. Beloved daughter Holmes's face darkened. "Beatrice Marchmont," he murmured, "the maid who vanished, or rather, the daughter disowned." I stared at him in astonishment. "But Sir Alistair said—" "Sir Alistair lied," Holmes said softly. "Or perhaps he simply told himself the lie so often that he began to believe it. Edward Marchmont's illegitimate daughter was not cast out into the world. She was hidden here, beneath the garden she once tended." He crouched beside the sarcophagus, examining the heavy lid. "It is unlikely her death was natural. More likely, she was made to disappear to preserve the family's reputation and their claim to Withering Garden." I felt a surge of revulsion. Murdered? Holmes rose, brushing dust from his hands. "I cannot say. But the fact remains. Her existence was erased, and those who knew the truth buried it along with her." He turned to me, his expression grim. "And now, decades later, the shadow of that crime reaches forward to claim another victim." We climbed back into the night air, the mist swirling around us like a living thing. Holmes replaced the stone slab with a final hollow thud. As we made our way back to the house, Holmes spoke quietly. The hidden inheritance, the secret child, the desperate suitor, all threads woven into the same dark tapestry. But there remains one question still unanswered. Watson, what question is that? I asked. Holmes glanced toward the house, where a solitary light burned in Violet's window. Who sent the letter that summoned Violet to the summer house? He paused at the threshold of the yew tunnel, his silhouette stark against the fog. Until we answer that, he said softly, the true architect of this tragedy remains free. We crossed the grounds in silence, the old stones of Withering Garden looming around us, heavy with the weight of secrets too long buried. Chapter 5. The Secret of the Summer House. The morning mist had thickened by the time we resumed our inquiries, wrapping Withering Garden in a damp shroud that muffled sound and blurred the outlines of the crumbling estate. Holmes had risen at dawn, as was his wont when a case had captured his restless mind, and we found ourselves once again before the skeletal remains of the summer house. "I have been considering, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low. "The presence of the hidden path, the evidence of a struggle, the secret letter, all point toward premeditation rather than chance. You believe Miss Marchmont was lured here?" I asked. Holmes tapped the head of his walking stick against the rotted door frame. "Lured or driven? Either way, this place holds answers." He produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket and began a meticulous examination of the summer house interior. I followed suit, though with far less success. To my untrained eye, it was little more than a tangle of rotted wood and creeping vines. Holmes, however, paused beside a half-collapsed bench near the back wall. He crouched and delicately brushed away a layer of dirt and debris, revealing a patch of worn floorboards beneath. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "The earth here is disturbed in a manner inconsistent with the surrounding decay. Someone has been at work recently." He pressed upon the boards, and with a faint groan of protest, they shifted under his touch. Together we pried up the loose planks, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Within lay a battered metal box, its surface corroded with age. Holmes lifted it out carefully and pried open the rusted latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several yellowed documents and a small velvet pouch. He examined the papers first, his eyes scanning rapidly. "Property deeds," he murmured, "and letters, old by the look of them, dated nearly 30 years past." He opened the velvet pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. A delicate necklace spilled out, a chain of fine gold adorned with a single pearl. Holmes held it up to the light, his expression unreadable. "A keepsake," he said, "or a token." I peered over his shoulder. "But what significance can these things hold for Violet's disappearance?" "That, Watson, is the question," Holmes said softly. "And we must tread carefully, for I suspect we are dealing with matters the Marchmont family would prefer to remain buried." He tucked the documents and necklace into his coat with a swift economy of motion. "Come, we must speak with Sir Alister once more." We found the baronet in the library, a sombre room lined with tall, dusty bookshelves and dominated by a massive fireplace. Sir Alister sat behind a great oak desk, a half-finished glass of brandy at his elbow. Holmes placed the metal box upon the desk with a deliberate thud. "Sir Alister," he said, "might you explain why these were concealed beneath the summer house?" Joe, old man, paled visibly. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass until I feared it would shatter. Where did you find them?" he asked hoarsely. "In a place not easily reached by accident," Holmes replied. "These documents pertain to the ownership of Withering Garden, do they not?" Sir Alister sagged back in his chair, the fight draining from him. "They do," he said heavily. "They represent a claim upon this estate, a claim I had thought long extinguished." Holmes said nothing, allowing the silence to draw out, pressing the old man to continue. "30 years ago," Sir Alister said at last, "my elder brother, Edward Marchmont, engaged in a scandalous affair with a woman of lower station, a governess no less. She bore him a daughter. When Edward died suddenly, there was a dispute over the inheritance. My father refused to acknowledge the girl's claim, and she and her mother disappeared. And these papers," Holmes prompted, "they are proof of the child's legitimacy, proof that could challenge my own claim to Withering Garden." "And what of Violet?" I asked, unable to keep the question from my lips. Sir Alister closed his eyes briefly, as though in pain. "Violet is the child of my late sister. I took her in after her parents perished abroad. She has no blood tie to Edward's line. But if these documents were to come to light—" He shook his head. "The scandal would be ruinous." Holmes paced, before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. "Someone knew of this hidden history. Someone who saw an opportunity or a threat." Sir Alister nodded grimly. "And now Violet has paid the price." Holmes halted abruptly, his face alight with the fierce clarity I had come to recognize. "Not paid, Sir Alister, not yet." He turned to me, his voice sharp. "Come, Watson. There is one more place we must visit before this day is done." As we left the library, I could not help but glance back at Sir Alister. He sat slumped in his chair, a man weighed down not only by the burdens of the present, but by the long shadows of the past. Outside, the drizzle had thickened to a steady rain. Holmes strode down the sodden path with renewed purpose, his coat billowing behind him like the cloak of a dark avenger. I hurried to keep pace, my mind racing with questions, but Holmes offered no answers yet, only the promise that the truth, like the sun behind the mist, would soon break free. Chapter 6. The Broken Path. The rain had slackened somewhat by the time Holmes led me back toward the stables at the rear of Withering Garden. A trail of muddy ruts carved through the soft earth, evidence of recent activity. Holmes moved with swift precision, his sharp gaze sweeping across the ground, the hedgerows, the half-collapsed fencing that hemmed in the estate's edge. "You will recall, Watson," he said as we trudged toward the stable yard, "that Mr. Hargreaves mentioned Lord Carroway's early arrival yesterday." "Indeed," I said, tightening my collar against the damp. "And yet, according to the servants, there was no formal announcement of his presence, no formal visit. Curious, is it not?" I nodded. He seemed to imply that he had merely come to remind Violet of her obligations. Holmes gave a mirthless smile. A rather theatrical explanation for a clandestine meeting on a wet October morning. The stables themselves were in better repair than much of the house. A low stone building with a pitched roof and a line of empty stalls. A stable boy, no older than 16, glanced up nervously as we approached. "Your name, lad?" Holmes asked. "Thomas, sir," he stammered, wiping his hands on his apron. "Good. Thomas, do you recall Lord Carroway's visit yesterday morning?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Rode up on his grey gelding. Fine horse, that one." "And did you see him leave?" Thomas shifted from foot to foot. "Well, not exactly, sir." Holmes's eyebrows rose. "Explain." "He came riding in fast, real fast. Then, after a bit, he left the horse in the stable and went off toward the garden on foot." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And when did he return?" "About half an hour later, sir. But he looked wrong, if you take my meaning." "Wrong? Clothes all muddy, hair mussed up, like he'd been fighting with someone, or something." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me before addressing the boy again. "Did he say anything?" Thomas shook his head. "Just saddled up and rode off like the devil was at his heels." Holmes reached into his pocket and flipped the boy a coin. "You have a sharp eye, Thomas. Hold your tongue about this, and there will be another waiting for you." The boy beamed and pocketed the coin. As we left the stables, Holmes paused, scanning the muddy yard. Without a word, he crossed to a patch of churned earth near the far fence. Kneeling, he drew a small, crumpled object from the mire. A handkerchief, sodden and stained. He unfolded it carefully. Embroidered in one corner were the initials V.M. Holmes's face darkened. "Miss Marchmont struggled here, Watson. And badly, if the state of this cloth is any indication." I felt a chill pass through me, not from the cold, but from the terrible implication. Holmes rose, brushing the mud from his knees. "Come, there is a broken gate at the far end of the property. I will see where it leads." We made our way along a narrow, overgrown track that skirted the garden's edge. The broken gate Holmes mentioned hung drunkenly from one hinge, its latch twisted and bent. Beyond it stretched a path, little more than a game trail, leading into the dense woods that bordered the estate. Holmes knelt once more, studying the ground. "Two sets of prints," he murmured. "One heavier, Carroway, by the depth of the impressions. The other lighter, hurried." "Violet?" I asked. "Almost certainly." We followed the trail into the woods, the wet leaves clinging to our boots. The undergrowth thickened, and several times we had to push aside tangled brambles that tore at our coats. Suddenly Holmes halted, his hand shooting out to stop me. Ahead, the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a ravine. A steep, rocky cleft, perhaps 20 feet deep, its sides slick with moss and rain. Holmes pointed to a scuffed patch of earth at the brink. "There," he said grimly. "Someone slipped." I peered over the edge and saw, half concealed by the undergrowth, a scrap of fabric fluttering from a jutting branch several feet down. Holmes produced a coil of rope from the pack he had insisted we bring, and, securing it to a sturdy tree, began his descent with practised ease. I waited above, my heart hammering in my chest. Minutes later he reappeared, his coat torn and streaked with mud. In his hand he held the scrap of fabric, a fragment of Violet Marchmont's walking dress. She fell, Holmes said quietly, or was pushed. He glanced once more into the depths of the ravine, his expression unreadable. "Nobody," he said. "No blood. Only the torn dress." He turned back toward the house, his jaw set. This is no simple matter of elopement or accident, Watson. We are dealing with something far darker. As we retraced our steps through the dripping woods, I could not help but feel the oppressive weight of the place, the sense of secrets buried, not only beneath the sodden earth, but in the very stones of Withering Garden itself. Holmes, however, pressed forward, his face alight with a fierce, unrelenting energy. The case, it seemed, was only just beginning to reveal its true depths. Wait, Chapter 7. The Letter in the Ashes. By the time we returned to Withering Garden, a pale, anemic sun was struggling to break through the mist, casting a sickly light across the grounds. Holmes wasted no time. He made me summon Sir Alister, Lady Sir Eugenia, and Lord Carroway to the drawing-room at once, claiming urgent business. Though I was not privy to his full plan, the glint in Holmes's eye told me that a decisive stroke was at hand. While I fulfilled my errand, Holmes slipped away to the library once more. When I rejoined him, I found him crouched before the massive fireplace, sifting carefully through the cold ashes with the tip of his walking stick. "You recall, Watson," he said without looking up, "that Mrs. Dudgeon mentioned a letter, one that visibly unsettled Miss Marchmont." "Of course," I replied. Holmes stirred the ashes with delicate precision. It occurred to me that a young woman frightened or desperate might seek to destroy such a letter to keep its contents secret. He extracted a charred scrap of paper and held it up to the light. The edges were blackened, but a few lines of ink survived, warped but still legible. "Not escape your blood. The price must be paid. Meet me at the summer-house before it is too late." Holmes's mouth tightened, as I suspected. A summons or a threat? I felt a shiver run down my spine. You think she was blackmailed? Or coerced? Perhaps by someone aware of the hidden inheritance and seeking leverage over Sir Alister? Or Violet herself? At that moment, the heavy tread of Sir Alister's boots echoed in the hall, accompanied by the softer steps of Lady Eugenia and Lord Carroway. Holmes tucked the fragment into his pocket and rose to meet them. The three figures entered the drawing-room, each bearing their own brand of unease. Sir Alister grim and hollow-eyed, Lady Eugenia composed but pale, Lord Carroway visibly irritated. At the summons, Holmes regarded them coolly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I shall not insult you with pretence. I have uncovered evidence suggesting that Miss Violet Marchmont did not leave this house of her own accord." Sir Alister stiffened. Lady Eugenia's eyes flickered with alarm. Lord Carroway gave a snort of disbelief. "What evidence?" he demanded. Holmes ignored the question. "I have also discovered that Violet received a letter 2 days ago, a letter whose surviving fragments speak of blood, payment, and a secret meeting at the summer-house." At this, Lady Eugenia swayed slightly, grasping the arm of a nearby chair for support. Sir Alister's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes's gaze swept the room, lingering for a fraction longer on Carroway. "I imply that the answer to Violet Marchmont's disappearance lies within these walls, and among those who inhabit them." Carroway's face darkened. "You go too far, sir." Holmes's voice was silky. "Do I? Then perhaps you can explain why you were seen in a dishevelled state after your supposed ride to the stables. or why a fragment of Miss Marchmont's dress was found near the ravine at the estate's edge. Carraway took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Are you accusing me?" "I accuse no one yet," Holmes said smoothly. "But I observe, and I deduce." Sir Alister sagged heavily into a chair. "Dear God, Nathaniel, tell me it is not true." Carraway threw up his hands in exasperation. "I argued with her, yes. She refused to honour our engagement. She raved about secrets and blood debts. Madness, I thought. I tried to reason with her." Holmes's voice was razor-sharp. "By dragging her through the mud? By pursuing her to the ravine?" Carraway's jaw worked furiously. "She slipped. I tried to stop her, to pull her back, but she fell. I panicked. I fled." An audible gasp escaped Lady Eugenia. Holmes stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. "Where is she, Lord Carraway? Dead or alive?" For a long moment there was only the ragged sound of Carraway's breathing. Then, in a broken whisper, he said, "I don't know. I couldn't find her. I thought she must have perished." Sir Alister buried his face in his hands. Lady Eugenia turned away, her shoulders shaking. Holmes regarded Carraway with cold disdain. "Whether through cowardice or cruelty, my lord, you have compounded a tragedy with deceit." He turned sharply to me. "Come, Watson. There is one place left to search, the base of the ravine, and we must hurry." We left the drawing-room in grim silence, the heavy doors swinging shut behind us. As we strode through the sodden gardens once more, Holmes's face was set like flint. "I do not believe, Watson," he said quietly, "that Miss Marchmont's story ends with a fall into darkness. No, there is something more at work here, and by heaven, we shall uncover it before this day is done." Chapter 8. Beneath the Withering Garden. The afternoon light, such as it was, grew weaker as we hurried across the grounds toward the ravine. The trees along the border swayed in the wet wind, their bare branches rattling like the bones of some vast skeletal hand. Holmes led the way with grim determination, the hem of his coat snapping behind him. We reached the edge of the chasm where we had stood earlier that day. The broken earth still bore the marks of the scuffle, the torn scrap of Violet's dress, fluttering like a signal of despair. Holmes tethered a second coil of rope to a nearby tree, testing its strength before turning to me. "You had best remain above, Watson," he said briskly. "I must descend alone this time. If there is danger below, it would not do for us both to be caught unawares." Despite my protests, Holmes was already lowering himself over the edge with practised ease, the rope hissing softly against the slick bark. I watched anxiously as he disappeared into the shadowed depths. Minutes dragged past with agonizing slowness. Then a faint cry drifted up to me. "Watson, bring the lantern, quickly!" I scrambled to comply, lighting the small oil lamp we had brought for just such an eventuality. I secured it carefully to a second rope and lowered it into the ravine. Moments later, Holmes's voice again rose, stronger this time. "I have found something!" Without waiting further, I began my own descent, my boots slipping on the wet stone. I found Holmes standing in a hollow at the base of the ravine, his lantern casting a pale circle of light upon the mossy ground. Before him, half hidden by brambles and earth, yawned the mouth of a tunnel, an ancient crumbling thing lined with rough-hewn stones. Holmes's face was alight with fierce satisfaction. "You see, Watson? An old smuggler's tunnel, no doubt. The perfect hiding place." "But hiding what?" I asked, my breath misting in the cold air. Without a word, Holmes drew a pistol from his coat and motioned for me to follow. We entered the tunnel, the lantern's glow throwing our shadows wildly across the damp walls. The air grew colder, tinged with the scent of earth and mildew. The passage sloped gently downward, the footing treacherous with loose stones and slime. We had gone perhaps 50 yards when we heard it, a faint, shuddering cry, barely more than a whisper. Holmes froze, every muscle taut. Then he moved forward swiftly, the lantern bobbing before him. The passage opened into a small chamber, the ceiling low and crumbling, and there, huddled against the far wall, was Violet Marchmont. She was alive, pale, soaked to the bone, her hair tangled and matted with dirt. Her eyes widened with terror at our approach, but when she recognized Holmes, she gave a sob of relief and collapsed against the wall. I rushed to her side, checking her pulse and finding it steady, though weak. "You are safe now, Miss Marchmont," Holmes said gently. "You have no further cause for fear." Between shuddering breaths, she managed to whisper, "He tried to kill me. He pushed me. I ran—" "Hush," I said, wrapping my coat around her shoulders. "You are safe." Holmes examined the chamber swiftly. "She must have stumbled into the tunnel after the fall," he said. "A stroke of fortune, or providence, that she found shelter here rather than perishing in the ravine." He turned to me. "We must get her back to the house at once. She is in no state to walk far." I nodded grimly. "I will support her." Between us, we helped Violet to her feet. She was light as a bird, trembling with exhaustion and cold. Slowly, carefully, we retraced our steps through the tunnel and up the ravine, Holmes going ahead to guide the way. When we emerged into the grey light once more, I heard Violet gasp with wonder, or perhaps with horror, as she beheld the twisted landscape of Withering Garden spread out before her. Holmes hailed the carriage that still waited near the stable-yard as we settled Violet inside, bundling her against the damp with every available blanket. Sir Alister and Lady Eugenia came hurrying across the lawn. Their expressions were a study in contrasts. Sir Alister with desperate hope writ upon his face, Lady Eugenia pale and stricken. When they saw Violet, both stopped short, overcome with emotion. Lady Eugenia gave a soft cry and sank to her knees beside the carriage, pressing Violet's hands to her lips. "My darling girl," she murmured. "Thank God." Violet managed a faint smile before exhaustion claimed her, and she sank into a deep, natural sleep. Holmes closed the carriage door quietly. "She will recover," he said, "but there is work still to be done." Sir Alister straightened, his face hardening. "You mean Lord Carroway?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Indeed. His guilt is clear, and his cowardice even more so." He turned to me, his voice low. "But there are deeper waters here, Watson. Deeper and more treacherous." I followed his gaze back toward the house, where the ancient stones loomed like sentinels against the misty sky. Holmes's jaw tightened. "The true secret of Withering Garden," he murmured, "has yet to be fully unearthed." Chapter 4X. A tangle of lies morning broke grey and listless over Withering garden, the sky a wash of cold ash. Within the house, the atmosphere was taut, the household caught between tentative relief at Violet's recovery and a deep, unsettled dread. Holmes, as ever, showed no sign of weariness from our long night's labour. He sat in the drawing-room, pale fingers steepled, his sharp eyes half-closed in thought. I had just set down a tray of coffee when the door opened and Sir Alister entered, his expression wary. Behind him hovered Lady Eugenia, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief to shreds. Holmes rose to greet them with a curt nod. "You are no doubt wondering," Holmes said, "whether the ordeal is at its end." Sir Alister's face was haggard. "Is it not? You have found Violet. You have exposed Lord Carroway's treachery." Holmes's lips thinned. "And yet, my dear sir, there remains the question of the letter, the instrument which lured Miss Marchmont to the place of danger. Lord Carroway may have been complicit, but I do not believe he penned that missive." Lady Eugenia gave a stifled gasp. Sir Alister said nothing, his gaze fixed rigidly upon the floor. Holmes turned to me. "You see, Watson, the phrasing of the letter was curious. Blood must be paid. Such a phrase suggests not romantic desperation, but knowledge of a grievance, older and darker than any mere broken engagement." He faced Lady Eugenia directly. "Madam, you knew of Beatrice Marchmont." Her face blanched as though he had struck her. For a moment she wavered, then with a great effort she composed herself. "I knew," she whispered. "Edward's child, the shame, was to be buried. It was father's will. After Edward's death we kept her hidden. But she grew restless, wild. One night she fled into the gardens. Lady Eugenia's voice broke. "She died there, in the ravine." Holmes's eyes softened briefly. "Not murdered? No," Lady Eugenia said fiercely. "It was an accident, but father could not afford scandal. He ordered us to bury her secretly. No stone, no mourning." Sir Alister sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "It was our burden. We believed it ended with us." Holmes's gaze sharpened. And yet someone else knew, someone who wished to punish the Marchmonts by using Violet. Lady Eugenia pressed the shredded handkerchief to her lips. I found the documents in the summer house weeks ago." Sir Alister looked up, aghast. "You?" "I thought about burning them," she confessed, "to protect the family. But I could not. They seemed like a monument to our crime. I hid them instead." Holmes's voice was low. "And when Violet spoke of feeling trapped, of fearing her marriage, I panicked," Lady Eugenia said brokenly. "I thought if she left, if she disappeared, the past would remain buried. I sent the letter. I thought she would run away, disappear quietly. I never dreamed Carroway would pursue her. I never dreamed—" Her voice failed her entirely. Silence fell, heavy and dreadful. Sir Alister buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Holmes straightened, his voice cold now. "Thus, through fear and folly, you placed an innocent girl in mortal peril." Lady Eugenia slumped into a chair, a shattered figure. After a moment, Holmes turned away. "Watson, summon Lestrade from Scotland Yard. There will be charges to answer." I moved mechanically to obey, my heart heavy. When I returned, Holmes stood, alone at the window, watching the mist roll once more over the garden. "Justice," he murmured, "is rarely pure and never simple." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. But it must at the very least be done. As the first hard knocks of officialdom sounded against the front door, Holmes retrieved his hat and coat with deliberate care. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "There is nothing more for us here." Together we walked out into the chill, the ancient stones of Withering Garden crumbling silently behind us, their long-held secrets finally, if imperfectly, dragged into the light. Chapter 6. The final pieces. The mist thickened about us as we made our way down the drive, the great house of Withering Garden receding into a pale, indistinct mass behind us. Holmes, silent and brooding, walked at a pace that forced me to quicken my steps to keep alongside him. I knew better than to intrude upon his thoughts when they were so deeply engaged. It was only when we reached the narrow country lane leading toward the village that he spoke, his voice low and reflective. "You see, Watson, how often it is that a great crime is born not of malice, but of fear and pride." I nodded, understanding his meaning. Lady Eugenia sought only to preserve her family's name, and in doing so, Holmes said grimly, she very nearly destroyed it. He fell silent again for a time, lost in thought. Then he added almost absently, "It is remarkable, is it not, how the past clings to the present? No matter how deeply it is buried, it has a habit of reaching up from the grave." We reached the inn where we had taken rooms during our investigation. A boy was already waiting with our valises, and a hired cab stood by the road, its horse stamping impatiently against the cold. As we climbed into the cab, Holmes turned his gaze back toward the misty silhouette of Withering Garden. "There are still unanswered questions, Watson," he said. I raised my eyebrows. "Such as?" "The documents," he said thoughtfully. "Lady Eugenia claimed to have found them weeks ago. Yet why hide them in the summer-house rather than destroy them outright, if secrecy was her only aim?" I frowned. "Guilt, perhaps." Holmes shook his head. "Possibly, but I suspect something more. An intention to preserve them. Perhaps for use, or perhaps for leverage. You think she meant to reveal them?" Holmes leaned back against the seat, steepling his fingers once more. "I think that had circumstances unfolded differently, Lady Eugenia might have found it convenient to expose the hidden lineage, perhaps as a means of securing greater influence within the family, perhaps even to oust Sir Alistair himself." The notion unsettled me more than I cared to admit. "And Lord Carroway?" I asked. "Will he be charged?" Holmes gave a small, humourless smile. "A coward and a brute, but not a murderer. His flight compounded his guilt, but I believe he did not mean to cause Violet's death, only to assert his claim over her." He gazed out the window, the fields rolling by in a grey blur. "In the end," he said softly, "it was the house itself, the weight of its secrets, that nearly destroyed her." We rode in silence for some time, the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves the only sound. At last Holmes stirred, his mood lifting somewhat. "You acquitted yourself admirably, Watson," he said. "As always, your sturdy good sense was an anchor in the midst of deceit and madness. I smiled, warmed by the rare compliment. "It was your deduction that solved the matter, Holmes." He waved a hand dismissively. "Perhaps. But even the keenest mind must sometimes rely upon a steady heart." The cab crested a rise, and before us lay the road back to London, stretching away into the mist. Holmes settled back into his seat, his voice almost cheerful now. "Come, Watson. The city awaits us. The fog, the gaslights, the restless hum of life. There are more mysteries lurking in its alleys than even the Marchmonts could contrive in a lifetime." I laughed softly and drew my coat tighter about me. Already the case of Withering Garden was receding into memory, another page in the curious annals of Sherlock Holmes. But some memories cling tighter than others, and I could not shake the image of Violet Marchmont's pale face, or the silent, mournful stones beneath the garden, where old sins had festered far too long. Chapter 2. Reflections in the Fogget was not until several days later, as we sat once more before the fire in our familiar lodgings at Baker Street, that Holmes chose to revisit the case of Withering Garden in full. The misty ordeal seemed already half a dream to me, its images, fog-draped gardens, hidden tunnels, secret graves, blurred by the bustling life of London. But Holmes, I knew, stored such cases in his mind with exacting precision, awaiting the proper moment to dissect them. He sat with his long legs stretched toward the fire, fingertips pressed together, his sharp gaze lost in the dancing flames. "You see, Watson," he began without preamble, "the tragedy at Withering Garden was not, at its heart, a matter of violence. It was a matter of inheritance." I set down my newspaper. "You mean the hidden claim?" "Precisely. The old documents concealed beneath the summer-house told the true story. That Edward Marchmont's child, Beatrice, was legitimate, and her bloodline superseded that of Sir Alistair." Holmes's voice was low, almost meditative. The guilt of that ancient injustice festered within the family like a buried rot. Lady Eugenia, discovering the proof, found herself torn between loyalty to her brother and a gnawing fear of scandal, and perhaps of her own diminished standing should the truth come to light. And so, I said, she sought to rid herself of the problem by driving Violet away. Holmes inclined his head. A cruel miscalculation. She assumed Violet would flee, sparing the family further disgrace. Instead, she set into motion a chain of events that nearly cost the young woman her life. He rose and began pacing, his dressing-gown trailing behind him like a shadow. "As for Lord Carroway," he continued, "his behaviour was brutish, but not born of premeditated malice. He saw his prize slipping away and attempted to seize it by force. His guilt is great, but it is the guilt of arrogance and desperation, not of murder." Holmes paused by the window, gazing out at the thick London fog swirling beyond the glass. In the end, Watson, the true villain, was afraid. Fear of disgrace, fear of the past, fear of change. He turned back toward me, a faint wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And fear, my dear fellow, is a more potent poison than any blade or bullet." We sat for a time in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly between us. Length, Holmes reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings in a slow, mournful refrain that seemed to echo the melancholy heart of the case. As the music drifted through the room, I found myself reflecting not only on the mystery we had unravelled, but on the fragility of human honour, the way it could be twisted by pride, bent by guilt, and shattered by time. Withering Garden would go on, no doubt. Violet Marchmont would recover, and perhaps some day restore the house to something of its former dignity. Yet the shadows of the past would never wholly lift from that soil. Some gardens, I thought, would always carry the scent of withering. Holmes lowered his violin and set it gently aside. "There are always more mysteries waiting, Watson," he said softly. "Always more secrets to be unearthed." And as the clock chimed the hour and the mist thickened beyond the windows, I knew, with a certainty born of long experience, that wherever those secrets hid, Sherlock Holmes would find them, and bring their hidden truths into the unforgiving light. Thus concluded the curious and sorrowful case of the secrets of the Withering Garden.